Beroges Rachem from Rabbi Baruch Chait from his album called Salonika Volume 5. Great to be with you. Let's light up the darkness. I'm really excited about today's daf. It is page 114, Kuf Yud Dalid, here in Tractate 14 of the Talmud, Yevamos, the laws of levirate marriage. We are finishing up chapter 14 today and moving into chapter 15. And ultimately, there's a 16th chapter here in this tractate before we finish it. Excuse me. I'm excited about today's page. Hold on. I'm excited about today's page because in my preparation, I just felt it took a little extra time, but I felt like a lot of threads that we've been talking about just come together in this page, and our understanding has advanced, and then we get back to a topic that was really interesting before and continues to be interesting again today, and we're going to have, I think, some fun as learners at a high level today. All right, who is with us as we get together to learn on a Wednesday? James in Indianapolis, Renee in Indiana, Sharon in New Jersey, Yosef in Massachusetts, Fred in Miami Beach, Yehud in South Carolina, Lucy in Minnesota, Jay in Missouri, Nancy in North Carolina, Guy in Ohio, Michael in Ohio, Paul in Chicago, Paula loves the music, the other Paul in the great Northwest, David in Indiana, Soren in Saigon, wow, across the other pond, across the Pacific. Great to have you with us, Soren. Gisette in Colorado. Welcome, welcome. Over there on the YouTube side. Aoife in Florida. Marjorie in Georgia. Okay. I had lunch today with a new friend, a guy named Michael Borkow, who is a new contributor to our Table for Five. And his journey is a lot like mine in many ways. He had a big education. He went to Harvard. He went to Columbia Law School. Then he left the law to go to Hollywood and became a TV writer, quite successful. And later, at that point, kind of later in his life, really felt the call to learn Torah, to connect with his Judaism. Took it very seriously. And today, like me, he's an Orthodox Jew, basically the same age as me. He actually spent 2 years, he took 2 years off from his TV writing career some time ago in the 2000s to learn in a yeshiva in Jerusalem. And we compared our journeys today, and it was funny for him, he sort of like connected with Judaism first and kind of had major doubts about the existence of God until later. And eventually, even after 2 years of study, was able to reconcile that. For me, I felt a connection to God. It just didn't make sense to me that a world would exist if God hadn't willed it. But I didn't think that Judaism had much to do with God until I came to it later in life and started learning and really connected not only with the learning and the law of Judaism, but the spirituality that I had not realized was in Judaism when I was an ignoramus. The reason I'm mentioning this lunch that I enjoyed very much with Michael is he said to me, Sal, I was at Harvard, and I was at Columbia Law, and I was in writers' rooms, and in all three places with really smart people. And I gave myself a little pat on the back that, I was on a level playing field with all these geniuses around me. But when I got to the yeshiva in Jerusalem, I think it was called Birkas Torah, but there's many other yeshivas where he would have had the same experience, he said. Just turn that up. He said, suddenly, I was like a guy from the playground league, maybe little league, on the court with professionals, with the big boys. And the intellectual capacity, the rigorous mental training to distinguish one thing from another, to learn how to think, to train oneself how to think and to think through a difficult problem. He was just so impressed with his fellow students at the yeshiva. And it was an eye-opener for him because when he was young and unconnected to Judaism, he felt like, and because of his skepticism about God and spirituality, he said he felt inside like people who are religious, it's like they turn their brains off a little bit. And part of his journey to becoming a Frum Yid, to becoming an Orthodox Jew, was realizing how intellectually rigorous faith and religion can be. So it was a wonderful lunch. I really credit him and I honor him. And I mentioned that today. It's interesting to have that conversation today at lunch, and then to come to today's daf and thinking, we as a class, as a group, if you're joining us for the first time, you'll find it challenging. Nothing about Talmud study is easy. But a lot of us now have been on this journey together. We just passed the 1/3 point of the 7.5 year Daf Yomi journey, page-a-day journey through the Talmud. And the whole class has definitely elevated, right? And we're learning as a group to think more rigorously, to understand more rigorously, to challenge, how a problem can be solved and how it can be approached and what are the right questions. And, the sages will sort of discuss a matter, get specific, and then bring a question or an issue which could undermine the whole enterprise. And they're not afraid to ask that difficult question at any point in the process. And that is something you learn in a modern yeshiva as well. So I'm proud of us that we can handle, higher level debate and learning and reasoning than we began as a group. And, we'll need some of those skills tonight. But I find it, sometimes it's confusing. Sometimes we bring to bear that sharp reasoning and it's exhilarating. And I felt exhilarated as I was preparing today's class. See what you think. All right, we picked this up at the bottom of page 113b. We've been discussing this Mishna number 1 in our short chapter, chapter 14, which we're going to complete tonight with God's help, which listed a whole bunch of cases. And I'll admit, when I read all the cases, I was like kind of comprehending, not quite comprehending what was really the distinction. But tonight we're going to review some of those cases as part of this discussion, and I think it becomes much clearer, right? And the underlying principle that is at work here is that a deaf mute in ancient times, and by the way, I checked this tonight before coming to be with you. I keep saying this, and I wanted to make sure it's true, that yes, the modern poskim, the modern rabbis who decide halacha about questions that come up in modern times that didn't exist in ancient times, and the greatest is probably Moshe Feinstein, have ruled that a person who is deaf has the mental capacity of a normal person. A person that can't speak has the capacity of a normal person. An actual deaf mute who can absolutely not hear or speak, even there may be ways for that person to learn to hear or learn to speak, in which case they're not considered legally incompetent like in our discussion here. But in ancient times, they didn't have the tools that we have in modern times, and so the deaf-mute was considered legally incompetent. And nevertheless, because they could communicate somewhat, as we've seen, there's a distinction drawn between the deaf-mute, who might be legally incompetent, and the imbecile, who is just absolutely never going to be competent in any way under law. Okay, so we've been saying that when there's a marriage with a deaf-mute, that marriage is created by rabbinic decree so that they can be married and not live in sin, and a deaf-mute can find a spouse. But that's a marriage by rabbinic law, not by Torah law, because of this uncertain legal competence to enter into marriage. And because under the laws of Yibum, there are situations where somebody who's married to a deaf-mute comes up for Yibum, right? Because it's, let's say, the brother of a man who died, childless, and he left a widow, and now there's already a man who's married, or let's say a woman who's married to a man. They're both legally competent, and then now there's now there's a new widow, and one of these four was a deaf-mute. And what implications that has, we're going to work through. But the key is that this marriage to a deaf-mute is by rabbinic decree, and therefore of a sort of lesser significance than a marriage by Torah law. And that has great implications in the law of Yibum, as we will see. In the second part of today's class, when we get into chapter 15, we'll be talking about an issue that we visited in chapter 10, which was a woman who is overseas, or a husband who goes overseas and disappears, and now the wife, is not free to remarry because she's married to a man who disappeared. She can't get on with her life and remarry. And so in chapter 10, we talked about that the court would accept the testimony of a single witness, though normally we have a requirement of two witnesses to establish important matters in law, like that this husband has died and she's free to remarry. But one witness will do, so she's not stuck, except that then she takes a risk. If the man comes back, she's going to have to pay a heavy penalty. She'll have to divorce the new husband when she remarried on the testimony of one witness. Today we do a related matter. What happens when the husband and the wife go overseas together, and then she comes back and she says, well, while we were away, my husband died. Do we believe her or not? The issue being that she's very much an interested party in whether we believe her testimony or not. She's a single witness. Okay, let's go. We picked this up today at the bottom of page 113b. The Gemara relates a story. Rav Yitzchak bar Bisna lost the keys to the study hall, and therefore they could not come into the study hall from the public domain on Shabbos. Let me explain that. They're going to be talking now about the legal competence of minors and the fact that a minor is not obligated in mitzvahs like an adult is. The minor will become an adult and then will become obligated, but while he's a minor, he's not obligated in mitzvahs. And there's a question of what are the obligations of an adult toward the child to prevent him from committing transgressions, even though the child is not obligated in the commandments of the Torah. Why are we talking about that? Because a deaf-mute is treated like a minor before the law in certain cases. So this incident is going to reflect on that. So Rav Yitzchak bar Bisna lost the keys to the study hall, and therefore they could not come into the study hall from the public domain on Shabbos. They couldn't carry the keys through the public domain on Shabbos so that they would be able to open the study hall. So now all these people who wanted to go into the study hall, not just to learn, but to pray on Shabbos, can't enter. Like the synagogue is closed because the keys are not around, and to get the keys here, they would have to be carried through the public domain, which is not permitted on Shabbos. So what do? It's a big problem. They want to open the show. So Rav Yitzchak bar Bisna came before Rabbi Pedat to ask what to do. And Rabbi Pedat said to him, now we're on 114a, go and lead boys and girls, minors who are not obligated in mitzvahs, and let them walk over there where the keys were lost. And if they find the keys, they will bring them to you of their own accord without you saying anything to them. Why is it? Could he just say to a child, go bring the keys to me? No, because then the child becomes your agent for you to desecrate Shabbos by carrying the keys through the public domain. But if you allow the child to find the keys and bring them to you, even though you didn't instruct them to do that, you're enabling the child to transgress the prohibition on carrying in the public domain on Shabbos. How is that possible? Because the child is a minor. The child is not obligated in the mitzvahs. So the question here is the adult, does the adult have a positive obligation to prevent the child from transgressing Shabbos? Or if are you going to just sit back and if the child violates Shabbos, he violates Shabbos, and you benefit from that when he brings the keys? He didn't really violate Shabbos because he's not obligated in Shabbos until he's an adult. We do educate the children to keep Shabbos so that they would become adults. It's natural to them. We don't encourage them to be transgressors. But this was a situation where the fact that the child's not obligated could be of benefit to the community. But you can't instruct the child to do it. The issue is, do you have an obligation to prevent the child from violating Shabbos? And apparently not, according to Rabbi Pedat. So the Gemara comments, apparently Rabbi Pedat maintains that with regard to a minor who eats meat from unslaughtered animals, right, now we get back to that subject, which is that is what's being compared to deafmutes and marriage. Do we have an obligation to prevent a child from eating the meat of an unslaughtered animal? An animal that was not slaughtered in a kosher manner, was not shechted. Yesterday, I misspoke. I said that eating meat from an unslaughtered animal is a treifa. No. I'm sorry, I misspoke. That the unslaughtered animal, a carcass that died or was killed in any other way than kosher slaughter, is called a Novela. A treifa is an animal that is wounded in such a way that it will die of that wound within a year, and it's inevitable. From then on, even if you slaughtered it in a kosher manner, it's still treif. That's why we get this word treif means unkosher, but it refers to that specific issue, that treifa. Okay, so at any rate, now we're talking about a nevela. So do we have an obligation to prevent the child from eating the meat of a nevela? He's not obligated in the mitzvahs, but do we have an obligation to prevent him from transgressing what would be a prohibition for an adult? So apparently Rabbi Pedat maintains that with regard to a minor who eats meat from an unslaughtered animal or violates other prohibitions, the court is not commanded to prevent him from doing so. And the Gemara comments, well, let us say that the following source supports Rabbi Pedat's opinion. A person may not tell a child on Shabbos, bring me a key, or bring me my seal from the public domain. However, he may allow the child to detach plants and allow him to throw in the public domain. And this shows that one need not be strict with a child who transgresses a prohibition, but one may not tell a child to transgress a prohibition. So you got that on Shabbos. Another thing you can't do is pull living plants out of the ground. That violates the prohibition of harvesting on Shabbos. So if you see a child, a little kid, 2-year-old, who's having fun pulling grass out of the ground, do you have to run over to him and say, that violates Shabbos? No, you don't have to do that according to this opinion. But you can't say to the child, bring me that key through the public domain. I can't pick it up, but you could. No, you can't make him your agent for your own transgression. But the Gemara rejects this suggestion. Abaye said that this is no proof, as it is possible that when they said that a child may be allowed to detach plants or throw something in the public domain, they were referring to an unperforated flower pot. Why? Why unperforated? Right? A flower that's growing in a pot that is not perforated, meaning that the roots haven't grown through the bottom of the pot into the ground. So this is a plant that is not in the ground. Can you cut that plant off from its source in the pot on Shabbos? Can you do that? No, you cannot do that on Shabbos by rabbinic decree, but you haven't violated the Torah law that prohibits harvesting on Shabbos, right? This is similar to harvesting from the ground, and that's why the sages prohibited it, but it's by rabbinic decree, not by Torah law. So Abaye said that this is no proof, as it is possible that when they said you don't have to prevent a child from detaching plants, it's referring to an unperforated flower pot, as that prohibition is by rabbinic law. Similar, when it states that the child is allowed to throw, this can be referring to throwing in a carmelis rather than a public domain. A carmelis is an in-between domain between a private domain and a public domain. And this has the status of a public domain only by rabbinic law. However, perhaps one is obligated to stop the child if he's pulling plants out of the ground or if he's throwing in a proper public domain. So the Gemara further suggests, come in here the following statement from Tractate Shabbos on page 121. If a Gentile comes to extinguish a fire on a Jew's property on Shabbos, one may not say to him, extinguish the fire, nor do we say to him, do not extinguish the fire, because the responsibility for his rest is not incumbent upon the Jew. A Gentile is not obligated in Shabbos, and a Gentile adult is his own age, and he does whatever he wants. If he sees a fire and he wants to put it out, he'll do so of his own accord. But we can't make him our agent to put out a fire on Shabbos. However, if a Jewish child comes to extinguish a fire on Shabbos, they do say to him, do not extinguish, right? Because just like it's prohibited on Shabbos to kindle a fire, it's prohibited on Shabbos to extinguish a fire. So we don't say, so to the Jewish child, we say to him, don't extinguish the fire, despite the fact that he is not yet obligated in the observance of commandments, because the responsibility for him to rest on Shabbos is incumbent upon us. And this shows that one does prevent a minor from violating a Torah prohibition. And then we'll tie that back to, so do we stop a deafmute from violating a Torah prohibition within the law of marriage? We'll come back to that. So Rabbi Yochanan said, this is referring to a minor who is acting with his father's consent. So even if the father did not tell him explicitly what to do, the child is aware of his father's wishes and acts on his behalf. That's why the father might have a positive obligation to stop the child from making a transgression, which the child believes he's doing with the father's tacit approval or even desire. That's why you might say that in that case, the father is obligated to stop the child from doing it. But where the child is really just doing his own thing, it might be a transgression since he's not obligated in mitzvahs. Maybe we don't have an obligation to stop the child from, pulling some plants out of the ground or throwing a ball in the public domain on Shabbos. So the Gemara answers, a Gentile acts, so the same reasoning can be applied with regard to a Gentile, that he acts with a Jew's consent, and yet in this case it is permitted for him to perform labor on behalf of a Jew. Right? The Gentile knows that if the fire is serious, that the Jew would prefer him to put it out. So now he is acting in accord with the Jew's wishes. Wouldn't we then have an obligation to stop him from acting as our agent in putting out the fire on Shabbos? But the Gemara answers, a Gentile acts in accordance with his own wishes. As an adult, he is responsible for his own decisions, and he is not considered to be following the instructions of others. And that's why you'll find sometimes in the Jewish world, something happens in the house of an Orthodox Jew on Shabbos, like, they're having dinner and by mistake, somebody elbows a light switch and all the lights go out in the house, and the Shabbos candles are in another room. Or the air conditioning gets turned off in the middle of the summer and it becomes unbearable and it's really going to make Shabbos enjoyment impossible. So then you might go outside, and if you're lucky and a non-Jew happens to be walking by, you could get a little help and he could turn on the AC or the light for you. So how does that work? Do you go outside and say, we're really messed up in there, our lights went out, can you come in and turn the lights on for us? Or we're boiling in there, our air conditioning went off, could you come in and just turn the switch of the thermostat? No, you can't do that. What you can do is go outside and say, hi, we're observant Jews and we can't touch light switches on Shabbos, and our switch by accident went off. And then you stop and you don't make a request. And then if the non-Jew says to himself, oh, these people need my help, and he says, would you like me to turn the switch on for you? And you say something like, I mean, that would be incredibly nice of you. But you don't say, yes, please do it for me. You see the difference? You can't make him your agent, but he can help you of his own volition. Okay, so come in here with regard to, do we have an obligation to stop children from making a transgression on Shabbos? Come in here. The son of a chaver, one who is devoted, a chaver means a friend, but in this context, it meant that community of people who were exceedingly meticulous in keeping the commandments, particularly with respect to tithing and tahara and ritual purity. So the son of a chaver is accustomed to going to his mother's father. He's accustomed to going to his grandfather's house, right? So he's the son of a meticulously pious Jew, but he's accustomed to go visiting his grandfather, his mother's father, who is an ignoramus, right? Who doesn't keep mitzvahs. So if he's going to go to the grandfather's house where the chaver, knows that the grandfather is not as meticulous about observance at all as in the home that the child lives in, so then what do? So in this case, the son need not be concerned, the chaver need not be concerned, the boy need not be concerned lest his grandfather feed him food items that are not tithed. If the father found fruit in the child's hand and he does not know where the fruit is from, he is not bound to separate tithes from the fruit, assuming that the grandfather didn't do it. And this indicates that one need not prevent a minor from eating forbidden food, because untithed food is prohibited to be eaten until it gets tithed, until tithes are separated from the produce. So Rabbi Yochanan said the sages were lenient with regard to doubtfully tithed produce, which is known as demai, since the prohibition against eating this produce applies only due to doubt. And most ignoramuses do separate tithes, or did in ancient times. So the sages were lenient in uncertain cases of this kind. And so the Gemara infers, rather, the reason that the sages were lenient in this is that it is demai, from which it may be inferred that if it was definitely untithed, right, if the father knew that the fruit in the boy's hand was untithed produce, so then he would be required to tithe the fruit before the boy could eat it. But didn't Rabbi Yochanan himself say that one need not stop a minor only when he is acting with his father's consent? So Rabbi Yochanan is uncertain with regard to this law, and therefore in this case he refutes it, and in that case he refutes it, which actually means he reached no definite conclusion about this matter, and therefore he treats each case on its own merits. So we haven't really resolved the question of, do we have this obligation to stop the child from transgressing? So come in here with regard to the son of a chaver priest who is accustomed to going to his grandfather's house, his mother's father, who is also a priest but who is an ignoramus. One need not be concerned that his grandfather will feed him ritually impure teruma, consecrated food that only priests can eat. The father's a priest, the grandfather's a priest, the grandfather's the mother's father, but the father is a chaver, the grandfather is an ignoramus. Nevertheless, what? If the father found fruit in the child's hand, he is not bound to take it from him. And this shows that even when the concern involves ritually impure teruma, which is a Torah prohibition and not just a case of uncertainty, one is not required to ensure that a minor does not sin. And the Gemara rejects this. That's no proof, as this is referring to teruma that is separated by rabbinic law, not a doubt concerning a Torah prohibition. So we don't have a proof yet. Come in here, another proof. A child may regularly suckle from a Gentile woman, like a wet nurse who's a non-Jew, and a child may suckle from a non-kosher animal. That's amazing. And in both cases, one need not be concerned that he might be considered one who suckles from a non-kosher creature. But one may not feed a child Novela, unslaughtered animal carcasses, or animals with wounds that will cause the animals to die within 12 months, that's the treifa, or repugnant creatures or creeping animals. A child may suckle from all of these, including the non-kosher creatures, even on Shabbos. But in the case of an adult, it is prohibited for him to suckle on Shabbos even from a kosher animal. And Abba Shaul says, we were accustomed to suckle from a kosher animal on a festival rather than milk it by hand in the usual way. In any event, the rabbi of this Mishnah, the Tana, teaches that one need not be concerned that he might be considered one who suckles from a non-kosher creature. The child might be, which indicates that a child may be left to eat forbidden food. We don't have that obligation to step in and prevent the child from eating forbidden food. But the Gemara rejects this. There, permission is granted due to a danger, because the child will starve to death otherwise. And that's why we let him do it, not because we have no obligation to stop a child from eating prohibited food. And the Gemara asks, if so, it should also be permitted for an adult, as saving a life supersedes these prohibitions. If an adult was starving to death, he could absolutely eat non-kosher food. So what's the difference if it's a child? And the Gemara answers, an adult requires consultation, i.e. doctors or other experts must examine him, establish that he is dangerously ill and will die unless he, drinks this milk from a non-kosher animal or directly suckling it even from a kosher animal on Shabbos. He needs a doctor's approval to do that. Like, he really has to be dying. And the Gemara retorts, well, a minor should also require consultation if he is in danger. And Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, said, no, there's no need for a special consultation from a doctor or some expert, as in an unspecified case, a child is in danger with regard to milk. It is always assumed that a child needs milk, and if he does not get it, he will be in danger. And if the only milk available is from a non-kosher animal or suckling it directly from a kosher animal on Shabbos, we allow it. So the Gemara analyzes, but that doesn't prove that we have no obligation to stop the child from eating prohibited food. So the Gemara analyzes the last opinion in the above Baraisa. Abba Shaul says, we were accustomed to suckle from a kosher animal on a festival, not on Shabbos. And the Gemara inquires, this is like a little digression on this area of law. The Gemara inquires, what are the circumstances if there is imminent danger to a person, even on Shabbos? It should also be permitted. And if there is no danger, well, then even on a festival, it should be prohibited. And the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary in a case where there is suffering, i.e. they suffer from thirst, but no danger is involved. They could wait till the end of Shabbos or the end of a festival and then drink. It's just that they'll be uncomfortable. That's not the same as danger. So the Gemara explains, and Abba Shaul holds that suckling directly from an animal is considered the prohibited labor of extracting performed in an unusual manner. It's prohibited to extract on Shabbos. Here it's performed in an unusual manner. It is prohibited to remove food from a source that is not fit for consumption. However, in this case, he does not do so in the usual way of milking, but rather by sucking directly from the animal. And therefore, it is not prohibited by Torah law, but it is prohibited by rabbinic law. Consequently, on Shabbos, when it is a prohibition punishable by stoning, the sages issued a decree in this case that even if the milking is done in the unusual manner of sucking it directly from the animal, still prohibited. But on a festival, when the labor is a negative prohibition that is not punishable by stoning, the sages did not issue a decree in a situation that involves suffering. So in any case, this source offers no proof with respect to how to treat a child who transgresses. Do we have a positive obligation to stop a child from eating prohibited food when that child is not yet obligated in mitzvahs because he's a minor? Come in here. The verse states, with regard to creeping animals and other non-kosher animals, you shall not eat them, for they are a detestable thing. So the sages interpret this verse as though it said ta'achilum instead of tochlum. Do not feed them to others. And the verse comes to warn adults against feeding these things to minors. I.e., not only is it prohibited for adults to eat these items themselves, but they may also not feed them to minors. What? Is it not the case that this means adults must say to children, do not eat, and prevent them from transgressing? Like the kid is about to eat an insect that is a detestable creature, definitely prohibited to eat. For an adult, it's definitely not a non-kosher insect, and he's about to eat it on his own. So we step in and say, don't eat that, even though it won't harm him, but because it is a prohibited food. And the Gemara rejects this explanation. No, The fact that we're told not to feed them to minors as well as don't eat them ourselves means that an adult may not feed the minor non-kosher food directly by direct action. The kid is hungry, you feel bad for him, you got nothing to give him. Okay, there's this prohibited food that you would not eat, but you could give it to the minor just because he's hungry. No, you can't do that. But if the child is going to pick it up himself, maybe you don't have to step in and stop him. Come in here, another proof. No soul of you shall eat blood. Leviticus 17:12. This serves to warn adults concerning minors. What, is it not the case that this means adults must say to children, do not eat blood? And the Gemara responds, no, here too it means that an adult may not feed minors by direct action. Another proof. Speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, none shall become impure for the dead among his people. Right? A priest is not allowed to make himself tameh, ritually impure, lest he have to, on an emergency basis, go and serve in the temple. That might be the reason, or maybe not. But at any rate, the Torah says a priest, a Kohen, a descendant of Aaron, Moses' brother, cannot make himself tameh, ritually impure, by coming into contact with dead people or walking into a cemetery, unless he's doing that for a very close relative. So that's this law. So it says, speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, say to them, none shall become impure for the dead among his people. It says, speak to the priests and say to them. This reiteration of speak and say comes to warn adults concerning minors. And what? Is it not the case that this means adults must say to the children, do not become impure, right? Not only can the adult not enter the Kohen, the adult Kohen cannot enter the cemetery, but he says to his son, the minor, you can't enter the cemetery either. If he was on his way in. And the Gemara rejects this. No, it is possible to interpret that an adult should not render the child not make the child impure by direct action. The adult can't take the child into the cemetery if he himself was going to go for some reason, or push him into the cemetery. That's obviously prohibited, but we haven't had a proof yet that the father priest is obligated to prevent his son from entering the cemetery. And the Gemara adds, and all these cases are necessary despite the fact that they apparently are redundant in teaching the same law, i.e. that adults may not feed minors forbidden food, as had the rabbi taught us only the case of repugnant creatures. Now we're on 114b. We would have said that the law is stringent in this case because they are prohibited by any amount. Creeping animal or insect is prohibited on pain of lashes, even if it is very small, provided that it is a whole creature. However, with regard to eating blood, which is not a Torah prohibition unless there is a minimum volume, one might say that there is no prohibition against directly feeding minors, as this prohibition is a bit more lenient. Therefore, we needed to hear both prohibitions. And if the Tana had taught us only the case of blood, we would have said that, well, they were stringent with regard to blood because there's a punishment of kares, death at the hands of the heavenly court, for eating blood. However, for creeping animals whose consumption does not entail kares, one might say that the law does not apply. Therefore, we needed both examples. And if the Tana had taught us only these two cases, we would have said it's because their prohibitions apply equally to all Jews. However, in the case of ritual impurity, which is a commandment for priests alone, one might say that there's not an obligation to prevent the child from doing that. And if the Tana had taught us only the case of ritual impurity among priests, we might have said, well, the case of priests are different because they are subject to many more stringencies than other Jews. And so they had to teach us both cases. So now we go to a different area of the law. The Gemara cites another relevant source with regard to a minor who eats the meat of unslaughtered animals. Come in here. If two brothers. And now we were using the case of do we prevent a minor from eating the meat of an unslaughtered animal to help us understand whether we prevent a deafmute from entering into certain kinds of marriage situations, because a deafmute is likened to a minor. So now we got sort of stuck in the law of, well, do we have an obligation to prevent a minor, from eating prohibited food? And to help us understand that, we're going to go back to our series of cases involving the deafmute. It's not really circular reasoning, as you'll see. So, to try and understand, do we have an obligation to prevent a minor from eating the meat of unslaughtered animals? Come in here. If two brothers, one of whom is a deafmute and the other is competent, were married to two competent sisters, and the deafmute married to the competent sister died, what should the competent brother who's married to the competent sister do? His brother's wife is released without yibum or chalitza due to the prohibition with regard to the wife's sister, right? When a brother dies, leaving a widow, but his brother is married to the widow's sister, everybody's done. There's no yibum or chalitza, and the new widow is free to go off and marry whoever she wants. But if the competent brother who's married to the competent sister, if he died, now the deaf-mute brother is the yavam. He's the surviving brother. He's married to a competent woman, right? But his marriage as a deaf-mute married to a competent woman, that is a marriage by rabbinic law, not by Torah law. So when his sister-in-law comes before him, right, his brother dies, and the sister-in-law comes before him for yibum. Yibum is a Torah obligation. He now has a levirate bond to his brother's widow. That levirate bond is by Torah law. As a deaf-mute, his marriage to his own wife is by rabbinic law. And for that reason, this is tragic, they make him divorce his own wife so that he can fulfill his yibum obligation. He divorces his wife with a bill of divorce, which is as valid as their original marriage. Right? The bill of divorce is like by rabbinic law that it can divorce a marriage that is by rabbinic law. Now, and they do that because he has a levered obligation, a yibum obligation to his brother's widow. But can he marry his brother's widow? No, because he's a deaf-mute. Can he perform it's the same issue. Can he perform chalitza with her? No, because he's a deaf-mute. And so his brother's wife is forbidden to him forever. He must divorce his wife as the levered bond applies by Torah law, whereas his marriage is valid by rabbinic law. However, in practice, he is unable to consummate levered marriage with the Yevama or perform chalitza with her. Now, they're making her prohibited to him, but it seems like they're not going to now render her an aguna, like who hasn't received chalitza and can't go off and marry some other guy. It seems they are going to let her do that. Now, the Gemara inquires, why should he divorce his wife with a bill of divorce? Why not let his wife continue to live with him after he divorces her, or after, their marriage is only a marriage by rabbinic law. It's of a lesser significance than his yibum obligation by Torah law. Okay, but why make him divorce his wife? Since his marriage is not a real marriage according to this by Torah law, let him continue to live with his wife. And the answer is, let her continue to live with him, as a deaf-mute is in the same category as what? A minor who eats prohibited food, for he is not legally competent. Consequently, even if he were to engage in sexual relations with his wife, this would not be considered a transgression. Why do we step in and make them break up? And the Gemara answers, if the matter concerned the deaf-mute alone, that would be the case. However, here he must divorce her due to the prohibition that applies to her. As his wife is legally competent, and just as she is forbidden to him, he is also forbidden to her. They have to divorce because he has this obligation to this woman who is his wife's sister. Come in here, different case. If two competent brothers were married to two sisters, now one of the sisters is a deaf-mute and the other is competent. And the competent brother who's married to the deaf-mute sister died, the competent brother died, and leaving the deaf-mute sister as the widow. So what should the competent brother who's married to the competent sister do? So the deaf-mute woman is released. Why? Because her yavam, right, she's the widow of a man who died and left a brother, but this brother-in-law of hers is married to her sister. End of story. She's free to go. The couple stays as they are. But if the competent brother who's married to the competent sister, if he died, what should the competent brother who's married to the deaf-mute sister, what should he do? He has to divorce his wife with a bill of divorce, a rabbinic bill of divorce, because his marriage to the deaf-mute is by rabbinic law. And as the competent sister came before him, right, the widow of his brother, comes before him for yibum, and the legal status of her levirate bond is by Torah law and therefore higher than the legal status of the marriage to his deaf-mute wife. And so he releases his brother's wife, who is not a deaf-mute, by performing chalitza, as they are both competent and can therefore perform chalitza. So now the widow is free to go. She's had chalitza with the brother. Now this brother, who had to divorce his deaf-mute wife so that he could perform chalitza with his Yevama, okay, so now they perform the chalitza. Can he not go back to his wife and reinstate that his marriage with a deaf-mute? No, because his deaf-mute former wife, who he'd like to remarry, is the sister of the Yevama with whom he performed chalitza. And a chalutza, a woman who's had chalitza, is like a divorcee. And he can't marry the sister of a woman that he divorced. So the Gemara again asks, but why should he divorce his wife with a bill of divorce? Let her continue to live with him, as a deaf-mute is in the same category as a minor who eats prohibited food, meat from unslaughtered animals. And the Gemara answers, as above, he must divorce her due to the prohibition that applies to him. So Rava said, another case, two brothers. One is a deaf-mute and the other is competent. And they were married to two sisters. One is a deaf-mute and the other is competent. And the deaf-mute brother, who's married to the deaf-mute sister, he dies. So what should the competent brother, who's married to the competent sister, do? So the deaf-mute woman is released due to the prohibition with regard to a wife's sister. End of story. But if the competent brother who's married to the competent sister dies, what should the deaf-mute brother who's married to the deaf-mute sister do? He has to divorce his wife with a bill of divorce, and his brother's wife is forbidden to him forever because he cannot perform chalitza or marriage with her. So Rava elaborates, but here is a case where there is no prohibition that applies to her, and there is no prohibition that applies to him, because they're both deaf-mutes who are not prohibited to each other. And yet it is taught that he has to divorce his wife with a bill of divorce. And Rav Shemaiah said this is a rabbinic decree due to the danger permitting a Yevama to a member of the public, since people might think that the deaf-mute sister is a full-fledged wife by Torah law. They're likely to conclude that it is permitted for this Yevama to marry someone other than the Yavam, like any other sister of the wife of a Yavam. However, in actual fact, she is not the sister of the wife of her Yavam, as the deaf-mutes are not married by Torah law, and she may not marry any other man because she is a Yevama whose Yavam cannot marry her or perform chalitza. And for this reason, the sages decreed that this deaf-mute husband must divorce his wife. In sum, this source too does not provide conclusive proof with regard to the question of a minor who eats meat from unslaughtered animals. We didn't solve the question, and the chapter ends. We move on. Chapter 15, we're on 114b. And in this chapter, we go back to examining the question of what happens when a husband dies overseas, and then a single witness comes and testifies that he died, and can the wife rely on that testimony to remarry? If the two witnesses came and said he died, she can absolutely rely on that. And if he came back, okay, we'll deal with that. But if she relied on one witness and remarried, and then the husband comes back, she's going to have to, and she remarried in the meantime, she has to divorce the new husband, and she's going to be prohibited to the old husband. She's just completely out of luck if she relied on one witness. Here in chapter 15, that one witness is herself. She and her husband were traveling. Let's see what happens then. Mishna number 1, chapter 15. With regard to a woman who went, she and her husband, overseas, if there was peace between him and her, i.e. the couple were not fighting at the time, and there was also peace in the world, i.e. there was no war at that time, and the woman came back by herself and she said, my husband died, so then she may marry on the basis of her own testimony. Likewise, if she said, my husband died, and they did not have children, but her husband had a brother, she may enter into Yibum with her Yavam. But if there was peace between him and her when they left, but there was a war in the world, Or if there was a quarrel between him and her, and there was peace in the world, and she came and said, my husband died, she is not deemed credible, as she may be mistaken or even lying. And we'll explain why. Rabbi Yehuda says she is never deemed credible when she testifies that her husband died, because she's so biased, in the outcome of that testimony, unless she came crying and her clothing was torn, in which case it is apparent that she's speaking the truth. We see the effect of this death on her. But that's not the law. They said to Rabbi Yehuda, you are incorrect. Rather, both this woman who cries and this woman who does not cry may marry on the basis of their own testimony, as long as there was peace between the husband and wife when they went on the trip and there was peace in the world. Now the Gemara. The rabbi of our Mishnah taught the clause, peace between him and her, because later he wanted to teach the clause, a quarrel between him and her. And likewise, he taught peace in the world because he wanted to teach afterward war in the world. So in other words, the fact that there was peace between them or peace in the world is of importance only because the opposite is the case in other situations that are dealt with in this Mishnah. Therefore, the Tana emphasized the lack of disruptions in the first case cited by the Mishnah. Okay. Rava said, what is the reason that one does not rely on her testimony when there is a war? Surely you're curious. It is because she says, that she says what she imagines to be the case. Can it enter one's mind that among all these people who were killed, her husband alone is saved? They were in a war zone. War broke out while they were visiting Ukraine. The husband was in a building. The building was bombed. She ran for her life. Later, she heard that there was a huge list of casualties. She went looking for her husband, didn't find him. He must have died. She never saw the body, but he must have died. If you say, since there was peace between him and her, she guards herself and waits until she actually sees that he died, even so, at times, it might happen that his enemies strike him with an arrow or a spear, and she thinks that he is certainly dead due to the wound. And yet, this is no proof that he is dead, and there are instances when someone prepares medicine for the wounded person and he survives, despite his apparently fatal wound. He looked like he was dead. He disappeared in the rubble. She had good reason to believe he was dead, but she should have waited because, he was very badly injured. He was in a coma for months. When he finally came to, it took him a long time to regain his memory and then his ability to travel. And that's why it took him so long to get back home, maybe even years. But she didn't see him dead. And that's why the sages don't rely on the wife's testimony that the husband died if, while they were traveling, there was war in the world. Or in the place where they were traveling. Now, Rava thought to say that famine is not like war. As in the case of a famine, she will not say and infer based on what she imagines to be the case that he died, because a lot of people died in that famine-stricken land, that her husband must have been one of them. It's not that kind of emergency. She would have surely stayed with him and actually seen him dead before she would say that he died. But then Rava retracted his opinion, and he said, actually, famine is like war. And why did he change his mind? Because it happened that a certain woman came before Rava and said to him, my husband died in a famine. Seeking to cross-examine her, Rava said to her, did you do well to save yourself by running away and leaving him? Did it enter your mind that with that small amount of sifted flour that you left him, that he could have survived? She said to him, well, the master also knows, meaning you also know, that in a case like this, he could not survive. And Rava understood from her comment that she did not actually see her husband die, but merely saw that he was weak from hunger. And then, she had, I guess, enough strength to go and, get some food somewhere on the way home. And she was saved, but he was at death's door and he must have died. But it might have happened that some miracle was performed and he found some food at the last minute, or someone came by. There was that movie where two guys were mountain climbing and one fell in a crevasse and broke his leg, and like there was no way he was getting out. And the friend like eventually just left because he was gonna die and he couldn't do anything for the one in the crevasse, and he just left assuming his friend was dead. But the one at the bottom of the crevasse miraculously crawled out with his broken leg and dragged himself down the mountain and lived. So miracles happen. Rava then changed his mind again. Not to say that famine is like war, but to say that famine is even worse than war in the respect that people will misreport what happened. Because in wartime, it is only if she said, my husband died in the war, that she is deemed not credible. This indicates that if in a time of war she says, well, he didn't die in the war, he got sick and he died in his bed, or some other unrelated manner to the war, well, then she would be deemed credible as if there were no war, as she would not make a mistake in this case. But whereas with regard to famine, she is deemed credible only if she says, he died and I buried him. In other words, during a famine, it must be clear that she is testifying about his actual death and not basing her claim on an assumption. I am near the very end. If you have a question or comment, get it in. Similarly, a rock slide is like a war, as she will say what she imagines to be the case, and she might not meticulously examine the facts to see if he was possibly saved. Right? The man, they were near a mountain. There was a rock slide. He was buried in an avalanche. He must have died. She didn't have the strength or capacity or ability to like lift off all the rocks and see if he was alive under there. He must have died. But maybe he ended up falling into a cave and he lived, and it took him a long time to work his way out of the cave the other side and to travel, etc. There's no guarantee that he died under there. Furthermore, an outbreak of snakes and scorpions is like a war, as she will say what she imagines to be the case, even though she might not be positive that he died. In a case of pestilence or a plague, some say it is like a war, and some say it is not like a war. And the Gemara explains, some say it is like a war, as she will say what she imagines to be the case, even if she's not sure that he died, because she assumes that if most everyone died in the plague, her husband could not have survived. Conversely, some say it is not like war, because we rely on that which people say in a common expression. For 7 years there was a plague, and not a person left before his time. In other words, with regard to natural disasters of this kind, it is known sometimes that one can avoid harm. And therefore, if a woman testifies that her husband died, she certainly witnessed his death. The point is, they need to be sure that if they're going to rely on the single testimony of one witness, on the testimony of one witness, and that witness is the wife who is very interested in the outcome of this testimony, so that she can be free to remarry, they need to be sure of the circumstances that she wouldn't have reason. It's not that she's lying, but that her imagination could get the better of her because she witnessed something terrible, but she didn't actually witness the death of her husband. Okay. Let's see if we have questions or comments. I am going to turn on the AC in here, even though it makes a buzz in the sound. It's just so hot in here. Okay, so with respect to carrying keys through the public domain and allowing a child to bring it, but not instructing a child to bring it, Sharon comments, my rabbi used to wear his keys, not carry them. So I'm not sure how well that works and in what circumstances, but the concept is that if you can incorporate your key as a jewelry, you're allowed to wear jewelry on Shabbos, right? So if, for example, you had a cufflink that actually had your key incorporated into it, okay, you're not carrying your key, you're wearing it, and so you could take it through the public domain. This would, of course, be in the absence of an Erev, when you can carry something like that in the public domain as long as it's not muktzah. Ira, a husband died, and wife married the husband's brother, a very wealthy man. He died, so she married the other brother, who was an actor. He died, and she married the other brother, a rabbi. I guess all of these people had no children. He died, and she married the final brother, a cemetery owner. Finally, she died. She married 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready, and 4 to go. I never heard that before. That's very good. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. Nina tells me that there were some other questions, but I ended up answering them over the course of the class, so that's it. Great to be learning with you. I hope you found tonight's class, as refreshing and exhilarating as I did, because for us to, parse and really follow the logic of everything we read tonight, we've come a long way as a class, and I find that thrilling. Have a great night, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night for page 115.